Hello, I'm Roland. I'm with Midstage Institute, and thank you so much for joining this LinkedIn Live today. We will be talking today about how to 10x your startup velocity, a really interesting topic that I know many of you are excited to hear about. So let's make sure all the technology is in order. If you can hear me really well, then please put this in the chat on the left hand and rigidity on the right hand, and then the results that the complex system generates are all. Stay until the end for that. First, what is your most important question about startup speed, or actually startup slowness, if that's what you're experiencing in your business? Please put this in the chat as well, and then we'll be able to answer those questions either during the webinar or as we get into the Q&A at the end. Who is this really meant for? Well, our core target group here for this content is tech startups between 2 and 20 million ARR and between 10 to 200 people. Out of these, we typically talk to founders and CEOs who primarily just want results faster. We also have co-founders and CTOs typically on these webinars who are often worried about, is the startup still adhering to its vision? And then of course the hired guns, the hired startup executives who just often want to be more professional with their teams. And the question is, how do you reconcile all this and get people to move into the same direction, all delivering results together? Often this does not come that naturally. People often feel like they're pushing harder, but actually in a way spinning in cycles. And this is a pattern that we see all the time. So I'm going to give you some examples here of what people experience. I'm not reading through all of them, but ever-changing priorities, execution lagging behind the intentions, silos not talking to each other. I'm sure you recognize many of these symptoms that we've seen throughout. Hello, I'm Roland. I'm with Midstage Institute, and thank you so much for joining this LinkedIn Live today. We will be talking today about how to 10x your startup velocity, a really interesting topic that I know many of you are excited to hear about. So let's make sure all the technology is in order. If you can hear me really well, then please put this in the chat so that we can all see who is participating. And also I'd love to hear where you're dialing in from in the world. So I've heard of people from San Francisco, New York, London, maybe even some time zone stragglers from Asia. So please put this in the chat. I would love to hear that. And finally, point of order before we get started, please do connect with me on LinkedIn. Make sure that you capture this QR code and that you are actually connected, not just following, because LinkedIn is where we publish all of our new content for founders and tech CEOs like you. So this is going to be the most important source of getting new tools and insights for your business. All right, cool. So 10xing your startup velocity. We have about 20-30 minutes here, so I'm going to give you as much as I can, but obviously there's going to be some stuff left. So at the end, I will tell you how to get more. For example, our signature book on scaling Silicon Valley style, but also other things like decision tools, video course, community, and other things. So stay until the end for that. First, what is your most important question about startup speed, or actually startup slowness, if that's what you're experiencing in your business? Please put this in the chat as well, and then we'll be able to answer those questions either during the webinar or as we get into the Q&A at the end. Who is this really meant for? Well, our core target group here for this content is tech startups between 2 and 20 million ARR and between 10 to 200 people. Out of these, we typically talk to founders and CEOs who primarily just want results faster. We also have co-founders and CTOs typically on these webinars who are often worried about, is the startup still adhering to its vision? And then of course the hired guns, the hired startup executives who just often want to be more professional with their teams. And the question is, how do you reconcile all this and get people to move into the same direction, all delivering results together? Often this does not come that naturally. People often feel like they're pushing harder, but actually in a way spinning in cycles. And this is a pattern that we see all the time. So I'm going to give you some examples here of what people experience. I'm not reading through all of them, but ever-changing priorities, execution lagging behind the intentions, silos not talking to each other. I'm sure you recognize many of these symptoms that we've seen throughout companies. But it's not your fault. What is at fault is often the wrong system of how you run your startup. So a bad system, as Sam Friedman says, will beat a good person every time. And it's also not your fault because in a way you've been lied to about cracking the startup code. It's a common myth in the whole startup and VC world that it's all about manic hustle, especially in the early stage. And in the early stage, it actually works. But as your startup grows beyond the 1-2 million ARR, the 10-20 people, then that pure manic hustle basically stops working. We all know this founder who believes that if you just push harder, you will become a unicorn, right? And I'm sure you recognize many of the sayings here, maybe even from yourself. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can also feel how cringy it comes across if the founder keeps pushing and pushing and pushing and it's not actually leading to more results for the startup, right? So the reason why that is because they push typically on the end results that are disappointing, right? So we want more sales targets to be reached. We want faster product releases. We want to hire more talent all at the same time. And we want, of course, raise more funding. This is often where startups fall short, but you cannot directly address those like lagging metrics. What you have to address are the things that are causing these things to underperform, right? Constantly shifting decisions, a way of managing your team that's completely ad hoc and scattered task assignments where nobody can see the wood through the trees, or downplaying resource and time needs when people need some time to get things done, right? So manic hustle in that sense scales not beyond the 10-20 people that we mentioned. People passing on the round, missing sales targets again, crucial product release delayed. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you get the picture. So the question is, why does manic hustle not scale? I want to share one theoretical insight with people that is really important to understand, because that'll help you see why the old way of operating your startup will no longer work as you grow a little bit further. Okay, let's go into this. It's a key insight from complexity theory or chaos theory, primarily developed by Norman Packard in the 1980s. And he looks at a startup as just one example of a complex system. Now, a complex system is characterized by a balance between chaos on the left hand and rigidity on the right hand. And then the results that the complex system generates are often in that what they call the edge of chaos. It's at the right balance between chaos and rigidity. Chaos defined as things like constant pivoting, unexpected decisions, many ideas but few results, you get it. Rigidity is more like your traditional organization where it's actually tight control, there's the right processes that cannot, right and rigid processes cannot be questioned, and lack of innovation. Both sides are really not leading to results. What's leading to results? The right balance between it, which Norman Packard calls the edge of chaos, right? So to an openness to debate and to changing opinions, but also a way to disagree and commit about things once the debate is over. And then data-driven learning, where it's not the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion that marks the day, but actually science and data that says, this data is actually showing what we should do better, and this is the decision that we should take. So in a chaotic scale up, if you are already like below average results, as you see in the circle on the right, then pushing harder, introducing more chaos, questioning more decisions, undermining process, all leads you away from that edge of chaos, away from the result zone, and makes things worse. And this is what we see all the time, why a startup still driven by manic hustle at that stage will simply not do very well. Of course, the opposite is the way to really go, right? So instead of adding more chaos, why don't you add a little bit more foundation, a little bit more clarity, so that people can start building on that and you start seeing actual results explode, because now people have that stability to actually build on. And this is how we develop this velocity system. So we help people move away from that chaos zone of manic hustle into the velocity zone, which is just enough foundation, but not too much rigidity to land in that stagnant zone, right? So it's ARR growth, it's efficiency, it's collaboration and innovation that all characterize the velocity way of thinking. And I also want to say that, as a founder, you know so much, and you and your team probably already have all the answers. It's not your fault. Your fault is, or the fault of the manic hustle myth, to be clear, is that you may be answering the wrong questions with those answers. And that's where you often need a little bit of wisdom from the outside, right? So instead of asking, why is my team constantly pulling me back into the weeds, we often encourage founders to try asking themselves, how can I make clear upfront what good looks like, so that I don't have to be pulled back into the weeds all the time? People already know what my expectations are. Higher level than that even is, instead of asking why are people building silos that are constantly in conflict with each other, why do I have to be the referee or the umpire all the time, try asking yourself, can I set cross-functional goals? Cross-functional goals that would drive alignment and results automatically, instead of me giving goals per function and then kind of setting them up for a competitive situation. And another one, number 3, is instead of asking how do I get people to deliver the things that I know are needed, why does it have to be you that decides what is needed? How do you hold your team accountable for company results so that they themselves can derive what is needed and you don't have to hold them accountable to all those individual tactical results? Many more questions where that came from, but it's just an example that you actually have all the answers already. What you may not have is the right questions to be asked. Now, this velocity system helps you reach that result zone in the middle, right? So again, ARR growth, efficiency, collaboration, and innovation. But I also want to state that this is not about turning into a boring corporation too quickly. We really think of it as a zone of 3, right? So you're no longer in that early startup mode, but you're also not going to be an incumbent. Just like an adolescent would not be very effective if they were trying to behave like a little child, but also not be very effective if they're trying to behave like a 50-year-old middle-aged guy, right? Adolescence in the human development is all about finding your own identity, trying many things out, sticking with some plans and giving up on others. This is really an apt metaphor for this phase of a startup life and going through this scale-up stage. And what that means is that the velocity acronyms that we use is really showing a very different behavior from both manic hustle and the stagnant situation. You recognize the acronym Manic Hustle here on the left. Again, I'm not reading through all the bullet points, but you'll recognize things like micromanagement, instability, the scrappy operations and so forth. You can read them right there. We want to change this mindset to a velocity mindset that goes around vision realization, discipline breakdown of the vision into what needs to be done when, exponential thinking, lightning fast iteration, ownership and openness for it, customer obsession, intense pressure and accountability, talent chemistry or talent everywhere, and then youthful exuberance or youthful enthusiasm. Very different from this stagnant situation. Again, I'm not reading through all of that, but where you see in a big corporation typically a lot of age cynicism, glacial processes and talent mediocrity. That's not what you want to strive for. So what does this Silicon Valley velocity system actually look like? Let me give you a quick overview. So first of all, it's about 4 pillars of transformation, right? So we want to help startups move from floundering to focus, from confusion to clarity, from helplessness to ownership, and from friction to flow. Those are the 4 pillars in which you see a true transformation taking place and getting from that haphazard early stage startup live to a really performing, a high performing scale up that can deal with this massive growth. And the tools we use for that are in a matrix of 6 blocks. So it starts with actually being clear and defined about the choices you make in a strategy, not trying to be everything to everyone, but really be very clear. And then the very core of it is the flywheel, which means you're building a business system, not just a product. Out of that come competences you need to build up, accountability for your people, as well as building capacity for your teams. And all of these together lead to investable metrics that investors immediately recognize and see how attractive that you are. So going through these in a little bit more detail quite fast. The core strategic choices are all about from running after shiny objects to focusing on the proven success factors for your business model, pulling that all together. The flywheel is the actual core of the system, right? So it's moving from disconnected silos to repeatable end-to-end results. And what you see here is like we've really defined the way that departments interact with each other in terms of the outcome they deliver for the next department. So product and engineering delivers marketable features so that marketing can deliver demand and leads, so that sales can deliver contracts, so that customer success can deliver happy customers, so that finance can cash the bills and get cash flow, and so that HR and people can build more capacity, which then leads to more features, more demand, more contracts, more happy customers, more cash, and so forth and so forth. This is really the system that we want every scale up to build, as opposed to focusing just purely on silos like product and go to market. Okay, out of that we then see the capacity building, the competences building, because sometimes parts of that flywheel simply are not working yet or are really falling behind how the rest of the company is already churning. And so instead of having a whole laundry list of projects and what could we possibly all be doing, we actually build very deliberately stronger core competence that are all making that flywheel build faster. So if, for example, demand generation is the part that is missing or it is too low, then how do you break down a high ambition like industry leading demand generation into like, okay, we will need over time 2 funnels, but let's start with the first funnel, and then what does it actually take to build that first funnel? Maybe out of the budget spending, we first need to get down to content and so forth. You see the example right there. The fourth one is accountability, right? So as you hire more people, you have to make sure that people are also feeling accountable and held accountable to their end results. So typically we divide up the leadership team between people each responsible for one part of the flywheel, and we have them make weekly commitments as to what's the one thing you can be doing to actually get better at your objective this week. And these are of course samples, but what we want to see is that there's a pattern emerging, like this person may be actually taking action and then moving yellow or red things into the green, but that other person is actually not seeing a lot of action, and this is then a signal for you to drive further conversations with that person. Are they still the right fit or not, right? Capacity is once you have accountable people, then how can you actually start ever improving the quality of the teams, not just the leadership team, but across the board, from A players to D players, right? So how do you get, actually the other way around, how do you get from more, ever more A players in your company, right? A players defined as people who both have a good cultural fit as well as high performance. And then out of the other groups, you can say, well, people with not so great performance yet, but that do have a good cultural fit, can we train them a bit more? C players are people with great performance, but a terrible culture fit, so maybe they need a stern talking to. And then D players, of course, are an easy option to free up their future. All this together then brings you to investable metrics. So from an almost plethora of key KPIs, how do you actually deliver the results that investors want to see? Again, you cannot target them directly, but you can be disciplined about the system underneath so that these metrics for investors automatically start occurring. ARR growth, rule of 40, as well as ARR per employee. All these metrics should be attractive compared to all the other startups that companies could invest in. So we help change that whole mentality of your startup leadership team to a velocity mindset, right? We break down the vision, we drive experimental thinking, lightning fast iteration, openness and ownership, customer obsession, intense accountability, top talent everywhere, and that youthful enthusiasm. So it's really up to you as a founder, as a startup leader. Do you want to work the old way, managing everything yourself, chasing up folks all the time and getting that hamster wheel with really nothing to show? Or do you want to work in a new way, right? Everyone on one page, a weekly cadence, and compounding results where everyone is working together in the same direction. People feel this may be overwhelming at the start, but to be honest, like, we've seen this be implemented really fast. If you can commit, you can create the first steps of velocity in just 13 weeks. And what we do is, across the board of those 4 pillars, focus, clarity, ownership, and flow, we make sure there's one thing every month that we start tweaking or improving. And very quickly, these things start compounding and getting you to real velocity in no time. Offerings, very quickly, there's a whole range of offerings, all the way from do it yourself, which is essentially an online course, to do it with us, where you add some coaching, do it with you, where somebody from our side starts helping you implement things, or even do it for you, where we place a chief velocity officer on a fractional basis in your company to build this whole system, so that the CEO and founder can work more on the market facing stuff and can just rely on velocity being implemented in the company. The best way to pick here, of course, is to get started with the strategy call. You've seen the link below already. So that is a good next step. Get the QR code, book a call with me or one of my colleagues right now, and we'll talk through the challenges of your startup and what it sounds like you should be focusing on next. Whether you then decide to work with the velocity system or not, you get those insights anyway, and they'll be immediately actionable for your team. What we have found, though, with founders who have implemented the Silicon Valley velocity system, they have started to build a lot more trust in their teams. They feel much more confident in their business, able to embrace their own zone of genius, so not that focused on things that they're not that great at. And of course, over time, they enjoy the freedom from the grind, which was often the main reason why they started the startup in the first place. Okay, so we will not have time to go through all the case studies in much detail. I'll leave you to reviewing these on your own. But in Redox's case, we help them deal with this growing complexity and get them to market leadership. In InRule's case, they were stagnant, and we turned them back into a velocity organization, attracting new investment. And with that, I would just ask, put in the chat, what was most helpful today? What have you learned so far? And where can we build a bit more conversation on what you've learned? As you do that, I will already move to also telling you for the resources that you were waiting for, right? So how do you get the signature book for free? Just comment book in the chat if you want it, and we'll send it to you via DM. Other things you can put in the chat are replay, course, community, coach. I guess this is all pretty simple, and we'll follow up on all these requests and send that to you as well. Cool. Again, get started with a strategy call. This is the best way to actually discuss the challenges of your startup and get actionable insight right away. And with that, I think we can start moving into Q&A. Let's see if everyone is there. Hello, Annie.
Hello, Roland. That was great. Thank you so much. I always enjoy listening to that. It never gets old.
Oh, excellent. Well, unlike me in that case, right? So,
Uh,
what questions do we have from the audience? I know you've been
yeah,
following the audience in several different channels. I think we're on 3 or 4 platforms right now, right? So,
we are. We are. We've actually got quite a few questions. There's some pretty good ones. I've kind of consolidated some of the similar themes to try to get the core to the core of the question. So the first one is, it's really, how do you know when it's time to transition from really the founder-led sales to a structured sales team? So we have this from somebody out in San Francisco.
oh, excellent. Well, we love everyone from San Francisco, but we also love other places, of course, everywhere, anywhere startup founders are to be found. But to get back to the question, really, I think it's a matter of having a little bit of a repeatable playbook that you figured out as a founder. So I think it's too early to get a salesperson, professional salesperson, whether executive or more, let's call it grunt level, to help you if you haven't figured out the basics of repeatability yet. Really, founder sales should be the first, let's say, 10 sales. Often they say the first 5 sales you just improvise, and then you start trying to reapply concepts that worked with the first 5, so that by 10 you start realizing this actually consistently works and this does not consistently work. At that time you can start developing that playbook and get your first professional salesperson to help you. Typically companies start with more like a BDR person that does a lot of like outreach and follow up on inbound leads while you still do the closing. And then over time, of course, you can bring that up to more senior level and get some closers in there as well. I would not recommend to start with a CRO or very high level VP of sales or something if you don't have the workers for that team yet.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I wanted to also, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm only gonna be able to get a couple in.
Sure.
But I wanted to kind of jump to something a little different about culture. And
Yeah.
so it's like, how do you really balance, a lot of these questions around balance, right? How do you really balance this whole need for speed with really the importance of building a sustainable company culture? Super important, right?
Yeah, I actually think those are not a contradiction, right? So I think the culture is in a way like the most important tool you have for the company to be speedy and to be striving for velocity. I think why is culture so important? Because culture are the decisions that people take when the founder is not in the room, right? And so really, like, if you want to run on multiple cylinders at one time, not always be dependent on that founder being in the room, then your culture needs to be very strong and also, you know, in a way, simple, right? So we always say simple scales, complex fails, right? So, you know, a culture that exists of 2 or 3 values only, for example, is much easier to apply than a list of 16 values like Uber had in the beginning. And you can see what happened with the culture there.
Yes. Unfortunately, we all know about that. So
doesn't mean they weren't successful, of course. So, you know, you can always argue either way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Okay. So also another question, really more about industries. So how do you really know if you're disrupting an industry or really just annoying it?
It's that same thing, but maybe in a different phase, right? So I think in an early stage, maybe there's even an earlier stage where the industry can just ignore you and don't think much of you, right? Many founders try to make that last for as long as possible. I still remember when Airbnb was already growing like crazy and they were constantly saying, we're not trying to disrupt the hospitality industry. We don't compete with Hilton. We don't compete with Hyatt. Of course they did, right? But it's sometimes much better to make people believe you're not actually disrupting the industry. To come back to the question, annoying or disrupting, in the end, it's really about, are you getting sizable market share from incumbents? And particularly, is that a high attractive market share in terms of not just revenue, but also profits, right? So if you can kind of get the cherries from the pie, the most attractive customers that are not being well served by the incumbents, then of course you are disrupting the industry big time. I would say, however, true disruption typically does not come at the earliest stage of startup success. There's a lot you have to go through early on in building foundations, getting to true proper product market fit, starting the early phases of scaling, and then getting to the mainstream market, not just early adopters in your market, and only then can you start thinking about disruption. So that phase is really well described in my book, Scaling Silicon Valley Style, that I wrote together with Doug, and where we really divide up that growth journey into different phases.
Yeah, perfect. Here's another question. It's really around productivity. So is there a productivity hack for founders to be in basically 5 places at once, or just accept that cloning is not yet a thing? Or
so many founders try to clone themselves. Even when they do try to delegate, they judge the person they delegate to as on the basis of, is that person doing exactly what I would with my personality and my style, which of course the totally wrong way to delegate, right? But that aside, the productivity hack is really to learn to scale through people, right? And so not to be too dependent on you having to do the work. It's not about your productivity. It's about the productivity of the system you're building, of the whole company that you're building. And so the sooner you can learn to work with people effectively, not just by assigning them individual small tasks, but assigning them whole areas, learn to trust, but verify, set the right targets, and scale your own abilities that way, the faster you can move to a very productive and a scaling company.
No, I definitely appreciate that. There's actually quite a few questions. I know we're at time, but for those of you who weren't able to get to your questions, we're happy to reach out. I think, Roland, you can reach out to them individually to address the questions that we weren't able to get to. Unfortunately, we didn't allow too much time for questions. Maybe we could do that.
Well, and we also have regular open office hours, right? That we also stream on the same channels.
Yeah.
So Annie has a much bigger list of questions typically coming in even for those events. So people can also join those events and submit their questions. And I would say our inboxes are always open, LinkedIn Messenger, YouTube chat, and other channels we do follow, and we do respond in person.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Like I said, we'll get back to you on your individual questions we weren't able to get to. Thank you, Roland, as always, and looking forward